Ruthless Alpha King bought a deaf Omega sold by her father. That's what folks whispered when the gold hit the table. A man feared from the border to the mountains, and a woman who never spoke a word. The street was quiet, but for the wind and the creak of the saloon sign, all eyes watching her climb down from that crate. But the man who bought her didn't know her secret. Every word, every threat, every lie. She heard it all. And in a land where a single overheard name can swing a rope or save a life, her silence was her weapon. Snow will fall, hooves will thunder, and the jailer's keys will rattle before this valley learns the truth. He thought he bought her freedom from shame. She might just be the one to buy his life back from the hangman. Before we begin, I invite you to take a breath. This space is for the quiet believers, the ones who know small kindnesses can ripple into something greater. The snow fell in thick, silent flakes over Silver Bluff, coating the mining town in a blanket of white. The December wind cut sharp and cold through the streets, carrying the bitter scent of wood smoke from nearby chimneys. Asa Holloway's boots crunched through fresh snow as he guided his horse toward the livery stable, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the late afternoon light. He had come to meet with the railroad agent about winter cattle contracts, a simple enough task that should have taken no more than an hour. Instead, he found himself caught in something far more complicated. The sound of rough laughter and jeering voices drew his attention to a crowd gathered near the livery's edge. There, standing on an old wooden crate, was a young woman. Her thin coat offered little protection against the biting cold, and her cheeks were flushed red from the bitter wind and obvious shame. But it was her eyes that caught Asa's attention. They stared straight ahead, refusing to acknowledge the crowd of men calling out crude bids and jokes at her expense. $2, someone shouted, followed by drunken laughter. $3.50, called another, treating the whole thing like some twisted entertainment. Beside the crate stood Jedediah May, swaying slightly with a bottle in his hand. Asa knew him by reputation, a failed rancher who spent more time at the poker tables than working his land. The man's bloodshot eyes gleamed with malice as he gestured to his daughter. "Come on, boys, my Eliza here's worth more than that. She's deaf as a post, but she's strong enough for ranch work, and she's not bad to look at neither." Jedediah's words slurred together, but the cruel intent behind them was clear enough. Something cold and hard settled in Asa's chest as he watched. He had seen his share of desperate men in these mountains, but selling one's own daughter to cover gambling debts, that was a special kind of low. The young woman, Eliza, kept her face carefully blank, but Asa noticed how her hands trembled slightly at her sides. Despite her father's claims about her being deaf, there was an intelligence in her eyes that suggested she understood far more than anyone realized. $5. Another bid rang out, followed by more laughter. Asa had seen enough. He stepped forward, his presence causing a ripple of silence through the crowd. Many knew him by reputation. King Holloway didn't earn his nickname by being soft, but neither was he known for cruelty. $20 in gold, Asa said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly through the sudden hush. He pulled the coins from his coat pocket and tossed them to Jedediah, who scrambled to catch them in his alcohol-numbed hands. The crowd's laughter died completely. $20 was no joke bid. It was enough to buy a decent horse or a month's supplies for a small ranch. Asa's stern expression made it clear this wasn't meant as entertainment. "Sold!" Jedediah crowed, clutching the gold pieces. "She's yours, Holloway, though I warn you, she's stubborn as a mule sometimes." Asa ignored him, stepping forward to the crate where Eliza stood. Her eyes met his briefly, a flash of wariness crossing her features before she looked away again. He held out his hand to help her down, noting how she hesitated before accepting it. Her fingers were ice cold when they touched his, and he could feel them trembling slightly. As soon as her feet touched the ground, she withdrew her hand, keeping her eyes downcast. "Come with me," Asa said, though he wasn't sure if she could hear him or not. He gestured toward his wagon, and she followed without protest. The townsfolk watched in silence as they walked away, their stares heavy with curiosity and judgment. Snow continued to fall, but Asa was aware of every footstep behind him, of the way Eliza walked with her shoulders straight despite everything that had just happened. The cold wind whipped around them, carrying whispers and stares from the dispersing crowd. Eliza remained silent beside him, her face turned slightly away, giving no indication whether she could hear the murmurs of the townspeople or not. Asa led her to his wagon, parked near the general store. He had supplies to pick up, but that could wait. Right now, his priority was getting this young woman out of the cold and away from the prying eyes of Silver Bluff's residents. He helped her up onto the wagon seat, noting how she managed to avoid direct contact this time, moving with a careful precision that spoke of long practice at keeping her distance from others. He climbed up beside her, leaving enough space between them to respect her obvious desire for distance. The leather reins felt familiar in his hands as he took them up, the horses stamping their feet in the growing snow, eager to move. As they pulled away from the livery, Asa caught sight of Jedediah May in his peripheral vision. The man had already stumbled toward the saloon, no doubt to spend his newly acquired gold. He showed no sign of regret or even a backward glance at his daughter. The snow fell heavier now, beginning to obscure the road ahead. But Asa knew these paths well, and his team was sure-footed. Beside him, Eliza sat straight-backed and still, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed forward as the town of Silver Bluff slowly disappeared behind them in the swirling white. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows as Asa loaded the last of his supplies into the freight wagon. Sacks of flour, dried beans, coffee, and other necessities were carefully arranged in the bed, secured against the rough journey ahead. Every few minutes, he found his gaze drawn to Eliza, who sat perfectly still on the wagon bench, her thin shawl pulled tight against the biting mountain wind. The general store owner had raised his eyebrows when Asa purchased an extra blanket and some women's necessities, but he'd kept his questions to himself. In a town like Silver Bluff, folks learned when to hold their tongue, especially around a man like Asa Holloway. Once everything was secured, Asa climbed up onto the bench beside Eliza. She didn't acknowledge him, keeping her eyes fixed straight ahead as she had done during the auction. The horses stamped impatiently in their traces, eager to be moving. Hiya! Asa clicked his tongue, and the team lurched forward. The wagon wheels creaked as they found their rhythm, following the rutted road that led out of Silver Bluff and into the high country where his ranch lay waiting. The first few hours passed in complete silence. The only sounds were the steady clip-clop of hooves, the groan of wooden wheels, and the occasional jingle of harness brass. The road wound steadily upward through stands of aspen and pine, their branches heavy with fresh snow. Eliza remained as still as a statue beside him, though Asa noticed how she shivered despite her efforts to hide it. The threadbare shawl she wore was hardly enough protection against the mountain cold. He considered offering her the new blanket he'd bought, but something in her rigid posture told him she wouldn't accept it. Not yet. As they navigated a particularly rough stretch of trail, Asa found himself thinking about the 20 gold pieces he'd spent. It wasn't that he couldn't afford it. His ranch was doing well enough. But what was he supposed to do with a woman who couldn't even hear? The whole situation felt like a fool's errand. $20, he muttered under his breath, shaking his head. What a waste of good money. I'll pay you back. The words were so unexpected that Asa yanked hard on the reins, bringing the team to an abrupt halt. The wagon rocked slightly as the horses snorted their protest. He turned to stare at Eliza, who met his gaze steadily for the first time. Her eyes were clear and intelligent, showing no trace of fear despite his obvious shock. You can hear? He said flatly. It wasn't a question. Yes. Her voice was low but firm. I've been pretending to be deaf for years. Asa sat back, studying her with new interest. Why? Eliza's hands tightened in her lap, but her voice remained steady. It was safer that way. When my father was drinking, he'd get mean. If he thought I couldn't hear his insults, he was less likely to use his fists. She paused, then added, and men talk freely around someone they think can't hear. Dangerous men, doing dangerous business. I learned to read lips young, and it's kept me alive more than once. The confession hung in the cold mountain air between them. Asa clicked his tongue, getting the team moving again as he processed this new information. The woman beside him was clearly more than she appeared. Survivor, not victim. Clever, not simple. They continued their journey through the pine-choked pass, the wagon swaying gently as it followed the twisting trail. Every now and then, Asa found himself glancing at his companion, seeing her in a new light. The rigid set of her shoulders spoke of years of careful vigilance. The way she watched everything without seeming to look at anything. That wasn't the behavior of someone who couldn't hear, but of someone who had learned to observe without being noticed. The sun was setting by the time they reached the line shack, a sturdy log structure that served as a waypoint between town and Asa's ranch. He helped Eliza down from the wagon, noting how she managed to accept his assistance while still maintaining her careful distance. The small barn beside the shack was cold but sound, and Asa took his time settling the horses for the night. He showed Eliza how to help him unharness the team, and she proved quick to learn, her movements efficient despite her chilled fingers. Inside the shack, Asa got a fire going in the small stone fireplace. The single room was spare but clean, with a narrow cot against one wall and some basic furniture. He lit a lamp, its warm glow pushing back the gathering darkness. Taking out the new blanket he'd purchased, he handed it to Eliza without ceremony. "Here, that shawl's not worth much against mountain cold." She accepted it with a slight nod, wrapping it around her shoulders. In the flickering lamplight, Asa could see the shadows under her eyes, the way exhaustion had begun to show through her careful composure. He rummaged in his supplies and produced some hardtack, offering her a piece along with a cup of water. She took both, eating slowly and methodically, as if measuring out each bite. The lamp cast dancing shadows on the log walls as Asa observed her. Everything about her spoke of someone who had learned to navigate a dangerous world by being cautious, watchful, and above all, silent. He wondered how many secrets she had overheard in her years of pretended deafness. How many times her facade had protected her from more than just her father's fists. They sat in silence as the fire crackled and popped in the hearth, each lost in their own thoughts. Outside, the wind whistled through the pines, carrying the promise of more snow before morning. Dawn crept over the mountains with hesitant fingers of pale light. The snow had stopped during the night, leaving the world wrapped in a brittle silence. Inside the line shack, Asa stirred the banked coals in the fireplace, adding kindling until fresh flames licked upward. The rich scent of coffee soon filled the small space as he set a battered pot on the iron grate. Eliza emerged from her corner where she'd slept wrapped in the new blanket. Her hair was neatly braided, though wisps had escaped around her face. She moved with the careful precision he'd noticed yesterday, watching him without seeming to. "Coffee?" Asa offered, pouring the black liquid into 2 tin cups. She accepted with a slight nod, wrapping her cold fingers around the warm metal. Steam rose between them as they sat in the growing light, neither quite ready to break the silence. Finally, Asa spoke. "We need to settle terms." Eliza's shoulders tensed, but she met his gaze steadily. $20 in gold. I'll work until it's paid off." "Fair enough." Asa took a long drink of his coffee. "You'll help Martha in the cookhouse, tend to the kitchen garden when spring comes. I pay my hands fair wages. You'll earn the same as any worker. And then I'm free to go?" "You're not a prisoner now," Asa said firmly. "But yes, once the debt's paid, you choose your path." Something in Eliza's posture eased slightly. She nodded once, sealing their agreement without words. They set out as soon as the horses were hitched, the wagon creaking under its load of supplies. The trail grew steeper, narrowing as it wound through stands of snow-laden pines. Asa handled the reins with practiced ease, guiding the team around treacherous patches of ice. By mid-morning, they'd climbed high enough to see the valley spread below them. Asa pulled the wagon to a stop at a wide point in the trail. "There," he said, pointing to a creek that cut through the landscape like a silver ribbon. "That creek feeds the cattle troughs on my land, stays running even in the coldest winters. Underground springs keep it from freezing solid." Eliza followed his gesture, taking in the vast sweep of land. Beyond the creek, a broad valley stretched toward distant mountains. "Ute winter grazing land," Asa explained. Been their territory longer than any white man's been here. We've got agreements about where my cattle can graze." His voice took on a harder edge. "Rail companies want to push a line through there. Other ranchers too, ones who don't care about keeping their word to the Utes." They continued their journey, the horse's breath steaming in the cold air. The sun was well past its peak when they finally crested a rise, and Asa's ranch spread out before them. A cluster of solid log buildings stood in a natural hollow, sheltered from the worst of the mountain winds. Smoke rose straight and steady from the chimneys of the bunkhouse and cookhouse. As they approached, ranch hands paused in their work to watch. Eliza sat straighter on the wagon bench, her face composed despite the curious stares. Asa guided the team to a stop near the barn, where two cowboys quickly moved to help with the horses. "New hand?" one of them asked, eyeing Eliza with barely concealed interest. "She's here to work," Asa said shortly. "Nothing more." His tone made it clear that questions weren't welcome. The men nodded, understanding their boss's unspoken warning. They turned their attention to unloading the supplies, directing Eliza toward the cookhouse where Martha, the ranch's cook, would be preparing the evening meal. The cookhouse kitchen was warm and bright, filled with the smell of baking bread and beef stew. Martha, a sturdy woman with gray-streaked hair, looked Eliza up and down before nodding approvingly. "Could use an extra pair of hands," she said. "You know your way around a kitchen?" "Yes, ma'am," Eliza replied quietly. "I can cook and clean." "Good. Start by setting the tables. Men'll be in soon enough." As the sun set, the ranch hands filed in for supper. They were a rough-looking bunch, their clothes worn and patched, but they cleaned up before coming to table and minded their manners as Martha ladled out generous portions of stew. Eliza moved efficiently between the tables, refilling coffee cups and replacing empty bread baskets. She kept her eyes down, but Asa noticed how she took in everything. The way the men interacted, their easy camaraderie, the casual conversations about cattle and weather and work to be done. The kitchen had nearly emptied. Most men headed to the bunkhouse for the night, when Asa heard it, the distant sound of hoofbeats approaching fast from the south. Through the cookhouse window, he could see fresh snow beginning to fall, thick flakes swirling in the gathering darkness. The rider was pushing hard, coming up the trail at a dangerous pace considering the weather. Asa's hand moved unconsciously to rest on his gun belt as he stepped onto the cookhouse porch, watching the approaching horseman emerge from the swirling snow. Through the swirling snow, Marshal Alton Briggs emerged from the darkness, his badge catching the dim light from the cookhouse windows. Two deputies flanked him, their horses breathing hard from the steep climb. Asa's stance remained relaxed, but his eyes were sharp as he watched them dismount. "Evening, Marshal," Asa called out. "Rough night for a social call." "No social call, King," Briggs replied, stamping snow from his boots. "Got business needs discussing." Asa nodded toward the cookhouse. "Martha's got coffee on. Might as well get warm while we talk." Inside, the kitchen still held the lingering warmth of the evening's cooking. Eliza moved quietly, setting out fresh cups and pouring coffee for the lawman. Marshal Briggs barely glanced at her, but his deputies watched her movements with curiosity. "The girl's deaf," Asa said shortly, and the deputies shifted their attention away. Eliza kept her eyes down, her hands steady as she worked. Once they were settled at the table, Marshal Briggs pulled out an official-looking document from his coat. "Rather not be doing this, King, but duty's duty." "What's the charge?" Asa's voice was level, betraying nothing. "Murder!" Briggs let the word hang in the air. "Rail company foreman named Marcus Wheeler, found dead 3 days ago, shot in the back near the survey camp in Thompson Valley." The coffee cup in Eliza's hand trembled slightly, but she maintained her composed expression as she set it down and withdrew to the far corner of the kitchen. "Never heard of him," Asa said, "and I haven't been near Thompson Valley in weeks." "Rail company claims different. Got witnesses say they saw you there, arguing with Wheeler about the proposed line through Ute territory." Briggs spread the warrant on the table. "You know how it looks, King. Your stance on that railway's no secret." Asa's jaw tightened. "Those witnesses got names?" "They will in court." The marshal sipped his coffee. "Look, I've known you long enough to know you're not the type to shoot a man in the back, but this warrant's solid and the rail company's pushing hard." So you're taking me in? Giving you a week, Briggs replied. Ride into Leadville yourself, talk to Judge Parker. Man like you deserves a chance to sort things proper like. Asa studied the marshal's face. Mighty generous. Don't make me regret it. Briggs stood, adjusting his gun belt. 1 week, King. After that, I come looking. The lawmen finished their coffee in silence. When they rode out, the snow had thickened, quickly swallowing the sound of their horses. Dawn brought clear skies and bitter cold. Asa walked the corrals with his foreman, Jim Tucker, discussing arrangements for his absence. The cattle would need extra attention with more snow coming in. Rail company's been mighty eager to push that line through, Tucker commented, watching the cattle crowd around the feed wagon, offering good money to ranchers who'll sign over right-of-way. Money ain't everything, Asa replied. Those grazing agreements with the Utes mean something. A soft crunch of snow made them turn. Eliza stood there, her breath visible in the morning air. I can help, she said without preamble. Asa frowned. This isn't your fight. I heard things in town before. Her voice was quiet but firm. Men talk free around someone they think can't hear. 2 gamblers mentioned a frame-up, something about the rail company making trouble for stubborn ranchers. Tucker whistled low. That's worth knowing. I can go back, Eliza continued. Visit the saloons. Nobody pays mind to a deaf girl serving drinks. I could learn more. Too dangerous, Asa said sharply. Rail companies playing for keeps. More dangerous than being sold by my father? Her chin lifted slightly. I know how to stay invisible, how to read men's faces and words. Let me help. Asa studied her, seeing past the quiet exterior to the steel beneath. She'd survived her father's cruelty by being clever, by turning her pretended weakness into a weapon. That same skill might now save his ranch and his life. Finally, he nodded. All right, but we do this careful. Tucker, send word to Sheriff Mills in Silver Bluff. He needs to know what's brewing. What about the marshal's deadline? Tucker asked. 1 week to prove I'm being framed. Asa's expression hardened. Time enough to find out who really killed Wheeler and why. Eliza's shoulders straightened, a determined light in her eyes. The morning sun caught the frost in her hair, making it glitter like a crown of silver. She wasn't just working off a debt anymore. She was choosing sides in a fight that could change the valley's future. The cattle lowed softly in their corrals, steam rising from their backs in the cold air. Above them, the mountains stood silent and white, indifferent to the schemes of men and railways. But in the ranch yard, the pieces were moving, the game beginning. A dead man in Thompson Valley, corrupt railmen, and a deaf girl who might hold the key to unraveling it all. 2 days passed like molasses in winter. The morning of their journey back to Silver Bluff arrived crisp and bright, the sun reflecting off fresh snow. Asa helped Eliza into the wagon, making sure she was wrapped thoroughly in thick furs against the biting cold. Her small frame nearly disappeared beneath the layers, but her eyes remained alert and focused on their mission. The town looked different in daylight than it had the night Asa first found her on that auction block. Snow blanketed the muddy streets, and icicles hung like crystal daggers from the eaves. They pulled up outside the Golden Nugget Saloon, where Asa had arranged with the owner for Eliza to work as a serving girl. Remember, Asa said quietly, helping her down, you're the barkeep's niece, just helping for the day. First sign of trouble. I leave immediately, Eliza finished. I know how to stay safe, Mr. Holloway. He watched her slip through the saloon doors, her shoulders squared despite her deliberately meek expression. Asa headed to the livery to stable their horses, but his thoughts remained with the young woman now moving among the town's roughest elements. Inside the Golden Nugget, Eliza kept her eyes downcast as she tied on an apron. The barkeep, Tom Murphy, had been well paid to vouch for her story. She moved between the tables with practiced invisibility, collecting empty glasses and delivering fresh drinks. Men barely glanced at her, speaking freely around the deaf girl. By mid-afternoon, the saloon filled with rail workers coming off their shifts. Their tongues, loosened by whiskey, began to wag. Eliza drifted near a corner table where 3 men huddled over their cards, their voices low but clear to her trained ear. "Rail job went smooth as silk," one man boasted, his mustache wet with drink. "Ain't nobody gonna stop progress now." Another player shuffled the deck with nervous hands. Wheeler shouldn't have gotten greedy. Man knew the risks of crossing the boss. Eliza's heart quickened, but she kept her movements steady as she wiped down a nearby table. The dead foreman's name had just confirmed she was on the right trail. Later, a new figure entered the saloon, a lean man with cold eyes who carried himself like a coiled snake. The room quieted slightly at his entrance. Eliza recognized him from whispered conversations. Crowder, a hired gun known for doing the rail company's dirty work. Crowder settled at the bar, ordering whiskey. 2 railmen joined him, and Eliza positioned herself carefully to watch their lips as they spoke. "Keeping Holloway busy till the snow melts," Crowder was saying, his thin lips curling in a smile. "By spring, won't matter what evidence he finds, company'll own half the valley." Eliza's fingers tightened on her serving tray, but her face remained blank. She continued her rounds until sunset, gathering every scrap of conversation she could read from unguarded lips. As darkness fell, she met Asa in a rented room above the Mercantile. The small space was sparse but private, with a pot-bellied stove providing warmth against the deepening cold. "Tell me everything," Asa said, his large frame filling the room's only chair while Eliza perched on the edge of the narrow bed. She recounted each conversation in detail, her memory precise. "The rail company's planning something bigger than just the murder charge. They're using it to keep you distracted, to keep you from interfering with their plans for the valley." Asa's expression darkened as the pieces began falling into place. "The Ute grazing lands. If they can push the railway through there, they'll control all the good water access," Eliza finished. "And Crowder, he's definitely involved in Wheeler's death. The way he talked about it, so casual-like." "Did anyone recognize you?" Asa asked sharply. "Number to them, I was just another invisible woman, not worth noticing." A bitter smile touched her lips. "Being underestimated has its uses." They set out for home the next morning, but the weather had other plans. Heavy snow began falling by midday, reducing visibility to arm's length. Asa fought the rains as the horses struggled through deepening drifts. "There's a church ahead," he called over the wind. "Reverend Stone keeps a parsonage for travelers." "We'll have to wait out the storm." The small white church emerged from the swirling snow like a ghost. Reverend Stone, a kindly man with silver hair, welcomed them without question, showing them to the modest parsonage attached to the church's rear. "The Lord provides shelter to all his children," he said, helping them bring in their supplies. "There's wood for the stove and some simple provisions. I'll check on you in the morning, weather permitting." The parsonage was clean but bare. A single room with a pot-bellied stove, a narrow bed, and a rocking chair. Asa immediately began building a fire while Eliza shook snow from their coats. "I'll take the floor," Asa said gruffly, laying out his bedroll. Eliza nodded, grateful for his consideration of her reputation. As warmth gradually filled the small space, they shared a quiet meal of dried beef and hard biscuits. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but inside it was almost peaceful. "Thank you," Asa said suddenly, "for risking yourself today. Not many would show such courage." Eliza looked up, surprised by the gentleness in his voice. "You saved me first," she replied simply. "And I've learned that sometimes the best way to fight injustice is to be the one person nobody thinks is watching." The storm raged through the night, but they were safe and warm in their sanctuary, each lost in thoughts of the struggle ahead. Tomorrow they would return to the ranch, armed with new knowledge of their enemy's plans. But for now, they rested, guardian and ward, protector and protected, their fates increasingly intertwined by forces neither had expected. The morning sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered yard as Asa's wagon pulled into the ranch. Ranch hands hurried to help with the horses, while Eliza carried her small bundle inside. The journey back had been quiet, both of them processing the weight of what they'd learned in Silver Bluff. After settling in, Asa sent word to Henry Tall Elk. The Ute tracker arrived by mid-afternoon, his tall frame wrapped in a wool coat dusted with snow. He dismounted gracefully, leading his horse to the barn where Asa waited. "Welcome, friend," Asa said, clasping Henry's hand. "Thank you for coming so quickly." Henry's dark eyes were serious. "Your message sounded urgent." Inside the warm barn, Asa introduced Henry to Eliza, who had been organizing tack. Henry acknowledged her with a respectful nod, noting how she met his gaze steadily, despite her quiet demeanor. "The rail company is moving faster than we thought," Asa began, leaning against a post. "Eliza gathered some troubling information in town." Eliza stepped forward, relating everything she'd overheard about the company's plans. Henry's expression grew grave as she described Crowder's words about the valley. "This confirms what our scouts have seen," Henry said, his voice low and measured. "Strange men with surveying equipment have been spotted in the Winter Valley. They carry rail company papers." Asa's jaw tightened. "That valley has been Ute grazing land for generations. Your people's herds depend on it." "As do yours," Henry reminded him. "The agreement between our peoples has kept peace and prosperity. If the rail company seizes control of the water access, they'll control everything," Asa finished. He pushed away from the post, pacing the barn's length. "This murder charge against me, it's just to keep me distracted while they make their move." "Then we must fight on both fronts," Henry said. "Clear your name and protect the valley." Asa stopped pacing, turning to face them both. "I won't let them steal what's rightfully yours, Henry. You have my word." "Our word," Eliza added quietly, surprising both men. "I may not have much, but I can help." Over the next several days, life at the ranch fell into a rhythm. Eliza rose early each morning, helping the cook, old Jake, prepare breakfast for the hands. She learned to measure flour by feel and judge the heat of the cast-iron stove by holding her palm above it. Jake, gruff but patient, showed her how to shape loaves of bread and make biscuits light enough to float. Between meals, she threw herself into ranch work. The foreman, Matthews, taught her to mend harness leather, showing her the proper stitches to hold against the strain of working cattle. She fed stock alongside the other hands, learning each animal's peculiarities. The physical labor left her pleasantly tired, so different from the anxious exhaustion of her father's house. Evenings brought a different kind of work. After supper, Asa would spread maps across the kitchen table, marking water sources and grazing routes while hands drifted in with news from town. Eliza sat quietly in the corner, appearing absorbed in mending but missing nothing of their talk. One night, after the others had gone, Asa remained at the table, studying the maps by lamplight. Eliza finished her sewing and rose to bank the fire. "You don't have to stay up," Asa said, not looking up from his work. "I don't mind," she replied, adding another log to the stove. "The quiet helps me think." Asa finally looked up, really seeing her for the first time that evening. "You've taken to ranch life well. Didn't expect that from a town girl." "I was never really a town girl," Eliza said, settling back in her chair. "Father's place was isolated, just a failing cattle lease. Mother tried to make it home before she died, taught me hymns and stories while we worked. After that," she trailed off, her fingers worrying the edge of her apron. "After that, you learned to be invisible," Asa finished gently. She nodded. "It was safer that way. But here," she gestured to the warm kitchen, the maps, the feeling of purpose that filled the room. "Here feels different." "Different how?" "Like maybe I could belong," she admitted softly. "Every night I pray for that, for a place that's real home, not just shelter." Asa was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "My wife used to say home wasn't about the place, but the people who make you feel safe enough to be yourself." It was the first time he'd mentioned his wife, and Eliza held very still, not wanting to break this moment of trust. "She was right," Eliza finally said. I haven't felt safe enough to use my voice in years. But here, she met his eyes. Here, I can speak. Understanding passed between them, about trust, about belonging, about the strange ways fate brings people together. The lamp flickered, casting warm shadows across the kitchen they were slowly making their own. Later that night, after Asa had retired to his room and the ranch was silent, Eliza knelt beside her narrow bed in the small room off the kitchen. She spoke her prayers aloud, barely above a whisper, but no longer afraid to give voice to her hopes. She prayed for guidance, for strength to help Asa clear his name, and for the safety of all who called this valley home. Outside her window, snow began to fall again, soft and steady, blanketing the ranch in pristine white. Tomorrow would bring more work, more challenges, more chances to prove herself worthy of the trust being placed in her. But for now, in this moment, she felt the first real stirrings of peace she'd known in years. A week of anxious waiting passed at the ranch. The morning frost had barely melted when Henry Tall Elk's horse appeared on the ridge, moving at an urgent pace. Asa stood from his work at the corral, watching as the Ute tracker guided his mount down the snowy slope. Henry dismounted in one fluid motion, his expression grim. "News from Silver Bluff," he said, following Asa toward the barn where they could speak privately. Eliza, who had been carrying feed to the chickens, fell in step behind them. Inside the barn's relative warmth, Henry shared what he'd learned. "Crowder's been drinking heavy at Malone's saloon, running his mouth about you." His dark eyes met Asa's. "Says he's going to finish Holloway soon. He's getting reckless confident." Asa's jaw tightened. "Drunk men talk too much. Might be our chance to get proof of what really happened to that foreman." "I can help," Eliza spoke up from where she stood near the door. "If he's bragging now, he might say more around someone he thinks can't hear." Henry nodded slowly. "She's right. The town knows her as the deaf girl. No one will guard their tongue around her." Asa ran a hand through his hair, considering. The idea of using Eliza as bait didn't sit well with him, but they needed evidence before his week of grace from the marshal ran out. "It's dangerous," he said finally, looking at Eliza. "Crowder's mean when he drinks." "I know how to be invisible," she replied steadily. "Let me try." They rode out that afternoon, taking the steep trail down to Silver Bluff. The winter sun hung low and cold in the sky, offering little warmth. Eliza sat between Asa and Henry in the wagon, wrapped in layers of wool. They had a plan. She would work the saloon as before, while Asa and Henry waited nearby, ready to move when she gave the signal. Malone's saloon was crowded when they arrived, miners and cowboys seeking shelter from the bitter wind. Eliza slipped in through the back door, tying on an apron as if she belonged there. She kept her eyes downcast, moving between tables with practiced meekness, while actually missing nothing. Crowder sat in his usual corner, already several drinks in. His lean face was flushed, and he gestured broadly as he held court with several rough-looking men. Eliza drifted closer, pretending to wipe down nearby tables. "That big rancher won't be trouble much longer," Crowder was saying, his words slightly slurred. "Should have seen how easy it was to frame him. Plant a few witnesses, spread the right story." He laughed, ugly and sharp. "Course, the foreman had to go, talk too much about the real plan. One shot took care of that problem." Eliza's hands trembled slightly as she worked, but she forced herself to move naturally, gathering empty glasses. Crowder continued bragging, explaining how the rail company had paid him well to eliminate anyone who stood in the way of their land grab. When she had heard enough, she made her way outside on the pretense of emptying a bucket. In the alley behind the saloon, she gave the signal they had arranged, dropping the bucket with a clang that would carry to where Asa and Henry waited. Moments later, Asa's tall frame filled the saloon doorway, Henry a shadow behind him. The room fell silent as Asa strode toward Crowder's table. The hired gun's face went from red to pale as he realized he'd been caught. "Quite a story you've been telling," Asa said, his voice carrying in the quiet room. "Care to repeat it for everyone?" Crowder shoved back from the table, his chair scraping loud against the floor. His hand dropped to his gun, but Asa was already moving. "I wouldn't," Asa warned softly. "There are too many witnesses here now, real ones." The hired gun's eyes darted around the room, taking in the crowd of faces turned his way. With a curse, he bolted for the back door, shoving past Eliza in his haste to escape. By the time Asa reached the alley, Crowder's horse was already disappearing down the street in a thunder of hooves. The saloon erupted in excited chatter. Several men who had heard Crowder's confession approached Asa, offering to testify about what they'd heard. Henry quietly gathered names while Asa found Eliza still standing by the back door, shaking slightly now that it was over. "You did well," he told her softly, leading her out to the wagon. "Very well." The ride home was cold, but somehow lighter, as if a weight had lifted. Crowder's flight was as good as a confession, and his boasting had given them witnesses to back up Asa's innocence. Eliza sat close between the two men, warmed by more than just her shawl. Back at the ranch, old Jake had kept supper waiting, a hearty beef stew that filled the kitchen with savory steam. Henry stayed to eat, discussing their next moves now that Crowder was on the run. The rail company would have to find a new plan, which bought them precious time. As Henry left to ride back to his people's camp, Asa and Eliza lingered at the kitchen table. She was ladling out a second helping of stew when his hand covered hers briefly on the spoon. The touch was warm, fleeting, but it sent a jolt through her entire body. She looked up to find his eyes on her face, something new and unspoken in their depths. "Thank you," he said simply, but his tone held a warmth she had never heard before. "For risking yourself today, for helping me fight this." Eliza could only nod, her heart beating so loud she was sure he must hear it. When he finally released her hand, she had to concentrate on not spilling the stew, her fingers tingling where his had touched. They finished their meal in companionable silence, but something had shifted between them, as subtle and significant as the changing of seasons. Outside, the wind sang through the pines, and somewhere in the darkness, a lone wolf called to its mate. Dawn broke crystal clear over the ranch, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold. The morning routine had barely begun, ranch hands carrying feed to the stock, smoke rising from the cookhouse chimney, when the sound of multiple horses approaching drew everyone's attention. Marshal Briggs led the group, his badge catching the early light. Behind him rode two deputies, and between them, looking small and mean on a borrowed horse, sat Jedediah May. A well-dressed man Asa didn't recognize brought up the rear, his expensive coat marking him as a city man. Asa stepped out onto the porch, his face carefully neutral. He'd known this peace couldn't last, but seeing Eliza's father sent a surge of protective anger through his chest. Inside, he heard Eliza's sharp intake of breath as she recognized the riders. "Holloway," the marshal called out, dismounting with a creak of leather. "Got some business to attend to." Before Asa could respond, Jedediah May swung down from his horse, stumbling slightly, his bloodshot eyes fixed on Eliza, who had appeared in the doorway behind Asa. "There's my girl," Jedediah snarled. "Come to take you home, Eliza." "This man had no right to you." Eliza's voice was steady, though Asa could sense her trembling. "I'm not going anywhere with you. I made a fair arrangement to work here." "Arrangement?" Jedediah spat in the snow. "He coerced you, took advantage of a helpless deaf girl." He turned to the marshal. "My own daughter, stolen away when I was, indisposed." The well-dressed man stepped forward, introducing himself with practiced smoothness. "Jonathan Pierce, representing the Western Rail Corporation. We have some serious matters to discuss." Asa's foreman and several ranch hands had gathered nearby, hands hovering near their gun belts. Asa gave them a subtle signal to stand down. Violence wouldn't help their situation. "She ain't deaf!" Jedediah suddenly shouted, pointing an accusing finger at Eliza. "Been lying about it for years, deceiving honest folks. Tell them, girl. Tell them how you've been spying and stealing information, making fools of everyone." The marshal's eyebrows rose as he looked at Eliza. She lifted her chin, refusing to show shame. "Yes, I can hear. I pretended otherwise to survive my father's drunken rages, to avoid his fists when he lost at cards or couldn't pay his debts." "You see?" Jedediah turned to the marshal. "A admitted liar, and there's more." He fumbled in his coat, producing a folded paper. "She stole money from me, valuable items too." Pierce smoothly took the paper, handing it to the marshal. We also have this sworn affidavit from Mr. May, testifying that he witnessed Mr. Holloway threatening the rail foreman on the day of the murder. Most illuminating details. Asa's jaw tightened. That's a lie. Jedediah wasn't anywhere near. We have collaborative witnesses, Pierce cut in. And now we find you harboring this deceptive young woman, using her to gather information under false pretenses. He shook his head with theatrical sadness. The court will find this very interesting. The marshal looked genuinely regretful as he pulled out 2 sets of papers. Asa Holloway, you're under arrest for the murder of Thomas Wells. And Miss May, you're being held as a material witness. We'll need you both to come with us. No, Eliza stepped forward. He's innocent. My father's lying. The rail company paid him to sign that affidavit. I heard Dash. Exactly, Pierce interrupted smoothly. You heard, because you were spying. Every word you speak only proves our case about your character and methods. The deputies moved forward, one taking Eliza's arm, while the other stood ready to restrain Asa. But Asa made no move to resist. His eyes met Eliza's, trying to convey reassurance even as his heart ached at her distress. Don't fight it, he said quietly. We'll sort this out proper through the law. Jedediah watched with malicious satisfaction as the deputies helped Eliza onto a horse. Should have stayed quiet and deaf, girl. Now look what you've brought on yourself. The marshal organized their departure efficiently, keeping Asa and Eliza separated in the group. As they rode away from the ranch, snow began to fall again, fat, lazy flakes that seemed to mock the warmth and safety they were leaving behind. The ranch hands stood in the yard, watching helplessly as their boss was led away. Old Jake, the cook, clutched his hat in gnarled hands. The foreman's face was dark with suppressed anger. Even the cattle in the nearby pasture seemed to sense the wrongness, their mournful lowing carrying on the winter wind. The snow fell harder as they rode, dusting shoulders and horse manes with white. Asa caught glimpses of Eliza ahead of him, sitting straight back despite her fears. His own thoughts churned with worry, not for himself, but for her. He knew what small-town jails were like, and the thought of her locked away, at the mercy of men who now saw her as a deceiver, made his blood run cold. The ranch disappeared behind them as they descended into the valley, becoming nothing more than a smudge in the thickening snowfall. The warmth and purpose they had built there seemed to fade with it, replaced by the bitter chill of betrayal and the growing weight of accusations that could destroy them both. The silence that fell over the group was broken only by the crunch of hooves in snow and the occasional jingle of tack. Each step carried them further from the truth they had worked so hard to uncover, toward cells that would keep them apart when they most needed to stand together. The ranch lay quiet in their wake, snowflakes drifting down to cover the tracks of their departure. The morning that had dawned so bright now felt as cold and forbidding as the bars that awaited them in town. Eliza paced the small room above Widow Turner's boarding house, her footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. The deputy's boots scraped against the hallway floor outside her door every few minutes, a constant reminder of her confinement. Through the frosted window pane, she could see the jail across the street where they held Asa, its stone walls dark against the evening sky. The room felt suffocating despite its decent size. Mrs. Turner had at least provided clean blankets and a basin of water. More kindness than Eliza had expected given the circumstances. But the comfort meant little when she knew Asa sat in a cold cell, facing false charges that could end his life. Voices drifted up through the floorboards, the boarding house's thin walls carrying sound all too well. Eliza pressed her ear to the floor, recognizing the smug tone of Jonathan Pierce, the rail company's lawyer. Those witness statements, Harrison gathered, they need to disappear. Pierce's voice was barely above a whisper. Especially the Mexican track worker's account. If the marshal gets those papers... A second voice, lower and rougher, responded. Already arranged. By morning, there won't be any evidence suggesting the foreman was killed on company orders. Holloway will hang, and that valley grazing land will be ours before spring. Eliza's heart pounded. Here was the proof they needed, slipping away like water through fingers. She sank onto the narrow bed, clasping her hands together in prayer. Lord, give me courage, she whispered. Show me how to make this right. Asa's words from days ago echoed in her mind. Sometimes justice demands we risk everything. A person's got to decide what they're willing to lose to do what's right. He'd said it while discussing the Ute grazing rights, but the truth of it burned in her chest now. The evening deepened into night. Snow began falling again, thick flakes catching the light from the street lamps below. The deputy's footsteps grew slower, heavier with fatigue. Eliza had almost dozed off when a soft scraping sound drew her attention to the window. A shadow moved against the glass. Her heart leaped to her throat until she recognized Henry Tall Elk's face. He balanced carefully on the sloped roof of the back porch, his movements silent despite the precarious position. With practiced ease, he worked the window latch open from the outside. "Miss Eliza," he whispered, sliding the window up slowly to prevent any squeaking. "We need to move fast." He passed her a bundle through the window, a heavy coat and sturdy boots. Eliza didn't hesitate, pulling them on over her clothes. Her hands shook slightly, but her movements were determined. "The marshal's camp is 20 miles north," Henry explained softly. "He took those witness statements there for safekeeping, away from town influence. If we ride through the night—" Eliza nodded, understanding without need for more words. She tucked her skirts tight and climbed carefully through the window. The snow-covered roof was slippery, but Henry's strong hand steadied her. They crept along the edge until they reached the corner where a stack of empty crates made a makeshift ladder to the ground. The deputy's shadow passed by her room's door one last time as they slipped into the alley. The falling snow helped muffle their footsteps and would soon cover their tracks. Henry led her to where he tied his horse in a sheltered stable yard. The big bay stood quietly as they mounted, Henry in the saddle and Eliza behind him, clinging to his waist. The horse's hooves were wrapped in cloth to deaden their sound on the packed dirt of the alley. They moved slowly until they cleared the edge of town. Then Henry gave the horse its head. They rode into darkness broken only by occasional glimpses of moonlight through the clouds. The snow fell steadily, coating their shoulders and the horse's mane with white. Eliza's face stung from the cold, but she barely noticed. Her mind was fixed on their desperate mission, reaching the marshal before those witness statements could be destroyed. Henry guided them along back trails and game paths, avoiding the main road where they might be spotted. The horse moved surely despite the darkness, trusting its rider's guidance. Eliza found herself grateful for Henry's tracking skills and quiet strength. He'd been Ace's friend long before she arrived, and his loyalty proved true now when it mattered most. "Thank you," she whispered against the wind, "for helping us." Henry's response was typically brief but carried weight. "Asa is a man who keeps his word. Such men are worth fighting for." They rode on through the deepening night, the snow continuing its silent fall around them. Eliza prayed they would reach the marshal in time, knowing that somewhere behind them, men were already moving to destroy the truth that could save Asa. But she refused to let fear overwhelm her. She had spent too many years being silent, pretending not to hear. Now was the time to speak, to act, to fight for what she knew was right. The horse maintained its steady pace, carrying them further into the snow-shrouded wilderness. Every hoofbeat brought them closer to either salvation or failure. Eliza held tight to hope, remembering the quiet strength she'd seen in Asa's eyes even as they led him away. She would not let him face this injustice alone. Whatever came next, she had chosen her path, no longer hiding, no longer silent, but riding bold through the night toward truth. The night wrapped around them like a frozen blanket, bitter winds cutting through their layers of clothing. Henry's horse pushed forward through deepening snow, its breath coming in white puffs against the darkness. Eliza's fingers had gone numb where she gripped Henry's coat, and her face felt raw from the relentless cold. The trail, barely visible in daylight, became treacherous in the swirling snow. Several times Henry had to dismount and lead the horse on foot, searching for familiar landmarks beneath the white blanket that covered everything. What should have been a 4-hour ride stretched endlessly as they picked their way through the wilderness. Dawn finally broke, pale and grudging through heavy clouds. The storm had passed, leaving behind a transformed landscape. Henry guided them toward a shape that gradually emerged from the whiteness. An abandoned line shack, its roof sagging under its burden of snow. "We need to rest the horse," Henry said, helping Eliza dismount. Her legs trembled as they touched the ground, stiff from hours of riding. "And ourselves?" Inside the shack, they found it bare but solid enough to block the wind. Henry quickly built a small fire in the ancient stove, while Eliza rubbed feeling back into her frozen fingers. The horse stood in the lean-to, gratefully munching on the hay they'd brought along. In the weak light filtering through grimy windows, Eliza's face showed fierce determination despite her exhaustion. "I won't run and hide," she told Henry as they shared the last of their jerky. "When we reach the camp, I mean to face them directly." Henry studied her with his characteristically careful gaze. "The rail boss is dangerous. He's already killed once." "Which is exactly why we can't skulk in shadows," Eliza replied. "The truth needs to come out, about the murder, about the land grab, all of it." She wrapped her hands around a tin cup of snow melted into water. "I spent years pretending to be deaf, living half a life. I won't hide anymore." Henry nodded slowly, respect showing in his dark eyes. They rested for 2 hours, allowing the horse to recover its strength before setting out again. The afternoon sun, though providing little warmth, at least gave them better visibility. They reached the outskirts of the marshal's camp as the light began to fade. Smoke rose from several chimneys, including the makeshift saloon where the rail boss had taken over the main room for his meetings. 2 armed men patrolled the perimeter, their rifles clearly visible. Henry led them on a wide circle through the trees, approaching from the least guarded direction. They left the horse well hidden in a grove of pines. "I'll draw the sentry away," he whispered. "You'll have maybe 5 minutes before he returns to his post." Eliza squeezed his arm in silent thanks, then watched as Henry emerged from cover, moving with deliberate noise through the brush. The sentry's head snapped up, and he moved to investigate the disturbance. As soon as he was out of sight, Eliza darted forward, keeping low. The back of the saloon loomed before her, its rough wooden walls offering little protection from the cold. She crouched beneath a warped window, her heart thundering in her chest. Voices drifted through the gap between the window pane and its frame. "The foreman was skimming money, Marshal." The rail boss's voice oozed false sincerity. "When I discovered his theft, he threatened to expose my own creative bookkeeping. I couldn't let that happen. There are investors to think of, reputations to protect." Eliza pressed closer, not daring to breathe. Through the distorted glass, she could make out the rail boss pacing, gesturing with a cigar as he spoke to the marshal. "So yes, I ordered him eliminated. Crowder did the job clean, and we had Holloway's rivalry with the foreman to provide cover." He laughed, a sound like gravel. "Who would question it?" Holloway's known for his temper, and the foreman had been pushing into his grazing rights. Every word burned into Eliza's memory. She had learned young to remember conversations exactly as she heard them, a skill born of survival that now might save Ace's life. The rail boss continued, growing more expansive as he bragged about his clever scheme. "The embezzlement would have come out eventually, but this way," he took a long draw on his cigar. "This way, we eliminate a problem, gain control of that valuable valley grazing land, and let a troublesome rancher take the fall. Elegant, wouldn't you say?" Eliza's fingers dug into the rough wood of the wall. The marshal's response was too quiet to hear, but the rail boss's next words came clear enough. "The witness statements? By now my men will have taken care of those. Nothing left to contradict our version of events." Another harsh laugh. "And that deaf girl they arrested? She'll be no trouble. Who would believe her over us?" A sharp whistle cut through the air. Henry's warning signal. Eliza forced herself to move, though every instinct screamed to stay and hear more. She crept back the way she had come, using the deepening shadows for cover. Her mind raced, cataloging every damning word she had overheard. She reached the trees just as the sentry returned to his post, slipping past him to where Henry waited with the horse. Her hands shook as she gripped Henry's offered arm to mount, but her voice was steady as she whispered, "I have it." Every word of his confession. They rode out as quietly as they had come, leaving the camp's lights behind. The rail boss's arrogant words echoed in Eliza's head, mixing with memories of Asa's quiet strength and unfailing honor. She had what they needed now, the truth that would save him. All they had to do was get back to town alive to tell it. The town's main saloon glowed like a lantern in the gathering dusk, its windows bright with lamplight. Inside, the usual evening crowd hunched over poker tables and whiskey glasses, tobacco smoke hanging thick in the air. The rail boss held court at the best table, surrounded by his men and local businessmen eager to curry favor. Eliza pushed through the batwing doors, her boots leaving snow on the wooden floor. Her face was windburned, her hair wild from the ride, but her eyes blazed with purpose. Henry's steady presence behind her gave her strength as she strode into the center of the room. "I have something to say," she announced, her voice carrying clear and strong over the murmur of conversation. Heads turned. Many recognized her as the deaf girl from before. The rail boss's face darkened with recognition. "That murderer sitting there," Eliza pointed directly at the rail boss, "just confessed to killing his own foreman and framing Asa Holloway for it." The saloon fell silent. Cards stopped shuffling. Glasses froze halfway to lips. The rail boss started to rise, but Eliza's voice cut through the quiet like a whip. "I heard you myself not an hour ago. You told the marshal how you ordered Crowder to kill the foreman because he discovered your embezzlement." Her memory, honed by years of careful listening, let her repeat his words exactly. "The foreman was skimming money, you said. When I discovered his theft, he threatened to expose my own creative bookkeeping." Angry murmurs rippled through the crowd. The rail boss's face had gone pale beneath its usual ruddy color. "This is absurd," he blustered. "She's clearly deranged." "You bragged about how elegant your plan was," Eliza continued relentlessly. "How you could eliminate a problem, steal the valley grazing land, and let a troublesome rancher take the blame. You even laughed about having your men destroy the witness statements." The marshal, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, stood up. His weathered face was hard as granite. "That part about the witness statements interests me particularly," he said, "seeing as those papers were indeed stolen from my office this afternoon." The rail boss lunged for the door, but Henry Tall Elk was there, blocking his path. Two deputies materialized from the crowd, hands on their weapons. "I heard every word through that warped window," Eliza said, her voice slightly softer now but still carrying to every corner of the room, every detail of how you murdered an innocent man and tried to destroy another. "It's true," a voice called from near the bar. Jim Wheeler, one of the local ranchers, pushed forward. "I can vouch for Holloway's whereabouts the night of the murder. He was helping us with a difficult calving out at my place. Half a dozen men saw him there." "That's right," another man agreed. "I was there too. Holloway spent hours in that barn, didn't leave until dawn." More voices joined in, men stepping forward to offer testimony. The marshal nodded to his deputies. "Take him into custody," he ordered, gesturing at the rail boss, "and send someone to round up this Crowder fellow." As the rail boss was led away, spitting threats and accusations, Henry slipped out the door. The sound of hoofbeats marked his departure toward the jail where Asa was held. The saloon erupted in excited conversation. Several men approached Eliza, offering to buy her a drink or asking for more details. She deflected them gently, making her way to where the marshal stood. "That was quite a performance, Miss May," he said quietly, "though I suspect it wasn't much of a performance at all." "No, sir," she replied. "Every word was true." He studied her face for a moment, then nodded. "I'll need you to make a formal statement, and we'll want to hear everything you know about Crowder's involvement." "Of course." Eliza swayed slightly, the exhaustion of the past 24 hours finally catching up with her. The marshal noticed and called for a chair. "Rest a bit," he said kindly. "There's time enough for statements later." As the evening wore on, more witnesses came forward. Men who had seen Crowder hanging around town in the days before the murder. Others who remembered the foreman mentioning concerns about the rail company's books. The pieces of truth, so long hidden, finally emerged into the light. When the initial excitement died down, Eliza slipped out of the saloon. The night air was crisp and clean after the smoky interior, and stars glittered overhead like scattered diamonds. Her horse, borrowed from Henry's string, stood patiently at the hitching rail. She mounted carefully, her muscles protesting after so much riding. The road back to Asa's ranch stretched dark before her, but she knew every twist and turn by now. Relief made her feel lighter than she had in weeks, though bone-deep weariness tugged at her limbs. The horses' hooves made soft sounds in the snow as they headed out of town. Above, the stars seemed to wink with promise, as if sharing in her quiet joy. Asa would be free soon, probably by morning, once the marshal processed all the new evidence and statements. The thought warmed her more than any fire could have done. The night wrapped around her like a familiar blanket as she rode, her mind full of the day's events and the future that now seemed possible. The truth had finally come out. Justice would be served, and tomorrow would bring new beginnings for them all. The first rays of dawn painted the jail's weathered walls in pale gold. Inside, Marshal Briggs's boots echoed on the wooden floor as he approached Asa's cell, keys jingling in his hand. The lock clicked open with a solid thunk. "You're a free man, Holloway," the marshal said, swinging the iron door wide. "Seems you had quite a few friends working to clear your name." Asa rose from the narrow cot where he'd spent the past several days. Even after nights of confinement, he carried himself with that characteristic quiet dignity, though fatigue showed in the shadows under his eyes and the stiffness of his movements. His usually neat clothing was rumpled, his dark hair disheveled, but his gaze remained steady and clear. "How many friends?" Asa asked, his voice rough from disuse. "More than you might expect," Marshal Briggs replied with a slight smile, "though one in particular deserves most of the credit. That girl of yours has more courage than most men I know." Concern flickered across Asa's face. "Eliza, is she safe?" "See for yourself." The marshal gestured toward the door. "There's quite a crowd waiting outside." Asa stepped out of the cell, pausing briefly to let his eyes adjust to the brightness. The marshal handed him his gun belt, hat, and the personal effects that had been confiscated upon his arrest. With deliberate movements, Asa buckled on the belt and settled the hat on his head. When they emerged onto the jail's front porch, the crisp morning air carried the scent of wood smoke and fresh snow. A gathered crowd of townspeople stood in the street, their breath forming clouds in the cold. Many faces Asa recognized, ranchers he'd done business with, shopkeepers, even some of the saloon regulars. "King!" several voices called out. Men stepped forward to shake his hand, offering words of support and congratulation. Jim Wheeler, the rancher who'd testified about the night of the murder, clapped him on the shoulder. "Never did believe you'd done it," Wheeler said firmly. "Not your style at all." Asa acknowledged the greetings with quiet thanks, but his eyes searched the crowd. Then the people parted slightly, and there she was. Eliza stood near the hitching rail, wrapped in a borrowed coat too large for her frame. Her cheeks were pink from the cold morning air, her eyes bright with lack of sleep but shining with relief. When their gazes met, a smile touched her lips. Small but real. Asa moved through the crowd toward her, barely registering the continued well wishes of the townspeople. He stopped before her, taking in the sight of her safe and whole. Without hesitation, he reached for her hands, engulfing them in his larger ones. They were cold from the morning air, and he instinctively rubbed them between his palms to warm them. "You did this," he said softly, his voice carrying a wealth of meaning in those 3 words. "We all did," Eliza replied, but her fingers tightened around his. Someone had brought their horses, Asa's big bay and the smaller mare Eliza had been riding. After a few more handshakes and thanks to the marshal, they mounted up and turned toward home. The sun had climbed higher, making the fresh snow sparkle like scattered diamonds. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, letting the town fall away behind them. The familiar trail wound through stands of pine and across open meadows. Around midday, they reached the creek that marked the halfway point to the ranch. Even partially frozen, the water still ran swift and clear beneath its icy edges. "We should rest the horses," Asa said, reining in beside the creek. They dismounted in the shelter of some large pines where the snow lay thinner. While the horses drank from a gap in the ice, Asa and Eliza stood side by side, watching the water flow. "Henry told me what you did," Asa said finally, breaking the quiet. "How you rode out to the marshal's camp, how you faced down the rail boss in front of everyone." He turned to look at her directly. "That took real courage." Eliza met his gaze steadily. "I couldn't let them win with lies. Not when I knew the truth." "You risked everything," he said. "Your safety, your freedom, all to help clear my name." "You did the same for me," she reminded him. "That day in town when my father—" She trailed off, then squared her shoulders. "You gave me a chance when no one else would. You trusted me enough to let me help, even knowing about my deception with the deafness." Asa was quiet for a moment, considering her words. The creek murmured beside them, and somewhere in the distance, a jay called. "I owe you more than my life," he said finally, his deep voice gentle. "I owe you my trust, and you've more than earned it." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "When I first saw you on that auction block, I acted on instinct, couldn't stand to see you treated that way. But now—" He gestured at the space between them, as if trying to encompass everything that had changed. "Now I know exactly who you are, what you're capable of, and I'm honored to have you standing beside me." Eliza's eyes widened slightly at his words, at the depth of respect, and something warmer in his tone. The morning sun caught the moisture gathering in her eyes, making them shine. "The ranch is your home now," Asa continued. "For as long as you want it, not because of any debt, that's long since paid, but because you belong there, with the work, with the people." He took a breath. "With me, if you're willing." The words hung in the crystal-clear air between them, honest and unadorned as the man who spoke them. Eliza's cold pink cheeks darkened further, but she didn't look away. "I'd like that," she said softly. "Very much." The horses shifted nearby, stamping in the snow, but neither Asa nor Eliza moved. They stood together in the winter sunshine, watching the play of light on the flowing water, each feeling the subtle but profound shift in their relationship. The trust between them, built through trials and tested by fire, had grown into something deeper, something that promised warmth through all the cold days ahead. The hard winter settled over Colorado's high country like a heavy blanket, bringing deep snows and bitter winds. At Asa's ranch, life fell into a steady rhythm as January turned to February. News filtered up from town that the rail company's scheme had thoroughly unraveled. Their fraudulent land claims collapsed under scrutiny, leaving the Winter Valley free for its intended purpose. Henry Tall Elk reported that the Ute herds had moved safely into their traditional grazing grounds, the cattle and horses dotting the snow-covered meadows like dark seeds scattered on white cloth. The sight brought a quiet satisfaction to Asa, who watched from the ridgeline during his daily rounds. This was how things should be. The land shared fairly, promises kept. The ranch's winter cattle drive went smoothly, with no sign of interference from the railmen or their hired guns. Asa's crew moved the herd to sheltered pastures, the work made easier by clear weather and calm stock. Even the newest hands commented on how peaceful things felt, as if the resolution of the murder case had lifted a shadow from the land. Through it all, Eliza found her place in the daily life of the ranch. Her skills in the kitchen proved invaluable. The smell of fresh bread became a regular comfort in the big house. She took charge of mending gear too, her neat stitching extending the life of leather and canvas that would have otherwise needed replacing. Each evening, she joined Asa in the barn for the night feeding. It became their quiet ritual, checking the horses, measuring out grain, and ensuring all was secure before the darkness settled in. Sometimes they talked about the day's work or plans for spring. Other times they simply moved in comfortable silence, their actions falling into an easy harmony. One Sunday evening, after a hearty supper with the ranch hands, Asa and Eliza lingered at the kitchen table. The crew had filtered out to the bunkhouse, leaving them alone with the crackling of the stove and the soft tick of the clock. Eliza gathered the last of the coffee cups, her movements unhurried. "That bread you made today," Asa said, his deep voice gentle in the quiet room. Reminded me of my mother's baking. Eliza smiled, pleased by the comparison. Your cook showed me the secret. Letting it rise twice makes all the difference. Asa nodded, then seemed to gather his thoughts. You know, he began carefully, your debt was settled weeks ago. More than settled, truth be told. She paused in her work, turning to face him. The lamplight caught the silver threading through his dark hair, softening his usually stern features. I've been meaning to ask, he continued, his eyes meeting hers steadily. Would you consider staying on, past the debt's end, I mean, the ranch? Well, it runs better with you here. Eliza set down the cup she'd been holding, her movements deliberate. A small smile played at the corners of her mouth, warming her entire face. I'll think on it, she replied. But the way her eyes crinkled at the corners told a different story. It was the kind of smile that carried promise, like spring waiting beneath winter snow. Asa nodded, understanding all she hadn't said. They returned to their evening tasks, the comfortable silence between them filled with unspoken possibilities. Snowflakes danced in the February dusk, settling in quiet drifts around Asa's ranch house. Warm lamplight glowed through the windows, casting a comforting aura over the stark landscape. Inside, the fire crackled cheerily, and Eliza sat by the hearth, her fingers deftly mending a soft woolen shirt. The soft thud of Asa's boots on the floorboards drew her attention. He entered the room, snow clinging to his shoulders, and set a heavy ledger on the table, dusting off the day's work along with the lingering chill. Without a word, he settled beside her. You really thought I couldn't hear all this time? She teased, needle flashing in the warm light. Her eyes sparkled with mischief, a contrast to the tame domesticity of the moment. He chuckled, a deep rolling sound that came more easily these days. Guess the ruthless alpha king met his match, a woman who hears everything. His lips curled with affection, the words a playful reminder of the daunting reputation he wore like a second skin. Eliza leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his frame. She had come to value this quiet strength, the sense of refuge it offered. Behind them, the wind buffeted the walls, a distant hum muffled by stone and timber. Yet the world outside felt less of a threat now, the dangers they had faced together cocooned by the valley's recent peace. Seems we both found new paths in this winter storm, Asa murmured, his arm wrapping around her shoulder. His hand rested gently, fingers threading through the loose strands of her hair. More like we made one, she replied, voice soft and sheer. Or maybe just followed where we were meant to go. Their journey, fraught with risks and trials, had steered them to this point, a narrow slice of tranquility hard-won and fiercely cherished. The ranch was safe, its operations steady. More than that, the valley thrived, each sunrise bringing hope to their shared dreams. Asa's gaze moved across the room. The fire's glow flickered over familiar shapes and corners, clutching hints of a future, broad as the sky and bright as the hearth's embrace. He drew her closer, a silent vow echoing between them. The night deepened outside, stars peeking through thinning clouds as if daring to witness this beginning. And there, nestled in warmth beyond the fire, they found certainty. In each other, the valley and the promise of days yet to come. A hopeful chapter awaited, with both their hands upon the ink. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow, I'll bring you another story crafted with heart.